She's just a useless housewife with no income, Your Honor. She hasn't contributed a single dollar to our lifestyle in 30 years. My husband, Richard, said those words with absolute confidence, pointing a finger at me across the courtroom while his expensive lawyer smirked. They thought they were about to strip me of everything: my home, my dignity, and my future. They believed I was helpless, stranded without a career after decades of building his empire from behind the scenes. But as Richard finished his arrogant speech, Judge Miller slowly took off his reading glasses, looked at Richard's attorney, and asked one simple question. Do you and your client genuinely have no idea who actually owns the corporate holdings, the patents, and this very building you are standing in? The courtroom went dead quiet, and within 10 seconds, Richard's confident smile completely vanished. My name is Amara Voss, and at 57 years old, I never imagined I'd be sitting in a cold county courthouse listening to the man I loved for 3 decades tear me down to nothing. Richard was 59, dressed in a tailored navy suit that I had picked out for him, looking every bit the self-made mogul he claimed to be. The nightmare started on my 57th birthday, when instead of dinner, I was served divorce papers. Richard had started secretly seeing his 34-year-old vice president of marketing, and he genuinely believed I would be an easy target to discard, a quiet woman he could toss aside with a modest payout while he kept the empire. He had forgotten who I really was. To understand how we ended up in that courtroom, you have to go back 30 years, to the day Richard and I got married. Back then, Richard's logistics company wasn't an empire. It was a failing startup buried under 6 figures of debt. What Richard conveniently forgot in front of the judge was that before I became his wife, I was a brilliant corporate strategist with a degree from one of the top business schools in the country. When his business was on the verge of bankruptcy, I made a choice that altered the trajectory of my life. I stepped away from my own promising career to save his. But I didn't just manage the home or handle the laundry. I quietly took over the back end of his business. While Richard was the charismatic face of the company, shaking hands and taking credit at networking dinners, I was working late into the night at our kitchen table. I mapped out the corporate expansion, structured our holding companies, negotiated the high-stakes supplier deals, and secured the initial patents that became the foundation of our wealth. I willingly let him take the spotlight. I believed we were a team, that my contributions in the shadows were just as valued as his public victories. But over the decades, a subtle and dangerous shift occurred. Surrounded by yes-men, lavish industry galas, and local magazine profiles calling him a self-made tycoon, Richard began to swallow his own hype. He genuinely convinced himself that he was the sole genius behind our success. My silence was mistaken for ignorance, and my sacrifice was rewritten as dependency. He stopped seeing me as his equal partner and started viewing me as nothing more than an invisible, replaceable housekeeper. The illusion of our happy marriage shattered completely 6 months before the trial. It started with subtle signs, unexplained late nights, sudden business trips to Miami, and a strange coldness in how Richard spoke to me. But the real blow came when I noticed unusual transfers leaving our joint operating accounts. I decided to do what I do best, dig into the numbers. What I uncovered was sickening. Richard wasn't just having an affair with his young vice president. He was actively attempting to siphon off millions into offshore accounts and shell entities to drain our joint estate before filing for divorce. He thought he was being clever. He assumed that because I had been out of the corporate office for years, I wouldn't know how to trace complex financial maneuvers. Instead of confronting him with tears or shouting, which would have only tipped him off, I kept my composure. I quietly called Arthur Pendleton, a top-tier corporate attorney and a trusted colleague from my early business days. What Richard had completely forgotten in his greed was how our empire was structured. 30 years ago, when we founded the holding company, it was my legal expertise that drafted the foundational agreements. To protect us from liability and high-risk investments, I had placed the core assets, the intellectual property, and our primary real estate under a private family trust. While Richard was busy buying designer bags for his mistress and opening hidden bank accounts, Arthur and I quietly activated the protective clauses within that trust. I ensured every single asset was locked down tight, leaving Richard holding nothing more than an empty title. The morning of the final divorce hearing arrived, cold and dreary. Richard strode into the courthouse with an unbearable air of arrogance, flanked by his high-priced lead attorney and an entourage of junior associates. He looked at me in my simple gray dress, as if I were a minor inconvenience he was about to permanently sweep off his shoe. When we sat down in the courtroom, Richard's lawyer immediately took the floor, trying to set a condescending tone. He presented a pathetic settlement offer, a mere $1,500 a month in temporary spousal support and 30 days for me to vacate our family mansion. They claimed that given my complete lack of career contributions and my status as a dependent housewife, this was more than generous. I sat right next to my attorney, Arthur, keeping my expression completely neutral. My heart was pounding, but I didn't utter a single word. Arthur had instructed me to stay silent and let them talk. Richard mistook my calm silence for utter defeat. He actually leaned over toward my side of the table and whispered, "You should have taken what I offered you privately, Amara. Now you get nothing." He then stood up when called upon and launched into a speech, calling me worthless and claiming he built every single dime of our wealth with his own bare hands. He dug his own legal grave on the court record, completely unaware that every arrogant statement he made was locking his trap shut forever. When Richard finally sat down, looking immensely proud of himself, Arthur didn't argue or raise his voice. Instead, he calmly stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked over to the bench to hand a sleek blue leather folder directly to Judge Miller. "Your Honor," Arthur said smoothly, "before we address spousal support, we need to clarify the legal ownership of the assets my client's husband claims to have built alone." Judge Miller opened the folder and began reading. At first, his expression was neutral, but as he flipped through the certified deeds, intellectual property filings, and corporate trust agreements, his eyebrows slowly rose. The courtroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence. Richard leaned in toward his lawyer, whispering nervously, wondering what could possibly be in that folder. After several intense minutes, Judge Miller took off his reading glasses, leaned forward, and fixed his gaze squarely on Richard's lead attorney. "Counselor," the judge said, his voice echoing in the quiet room, "do you and your client genuinely have no idea who actually owns the corporate holdings, the patents, and this very building your client's firm operates out of?" Richard's lawyer blinked, visibly caught off guard. "Your Honor, my client is the sole founder and CEO of Vanguard Logistics." "Your client is an employee," Judge Miller interrupted sternly. "According to these binding, irrevocable trust documents executed 30 years ago, the parent entity that holds 100% of the shares, the patents, and the commercial real estate is Vance Global Holdings, which is owned solely and individually by Mrs. Amara Voss." The courtroom went so quiet you could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Richard's face flushed a deep, panicked red, while his lead attorney turned completely pale, hurriedly shuffling through his own paperwork as if trying to find a magical exit clause. Judge Miller didn't hold back. He looked down at Richard over his glasses and laid out the brutal legal reality. "Mr. Vance, you claim your wife was a dependent with no financial contribution, yet the very roof over your corporate headquarters belongs to her trust. The patents driving your company's revenues are licensed under her name. You are not the owner of an empire. You are an executive officer serving at the pleasure of a board that consists entirely of Amara Voss." Richard sputtered, grabbing the edge of the table. That's impossible. I signed those documents decades ago. It was just a liability tax structure." "It was a legally binding trust agreement," Judge Miller replied coldly. "And given the evidence presented regarding your recent attempts to drain joint accounts and transfer corporate capital offshore without board approval, Mrs. Voss's counsel has grounds to terminate your employment and initiate immediate eviction proceedings from the marital residence." Richard turned to his lawyer, his voice cracking with desperation. "Do something. Tell him he's wrong." But his attorney simply leaned in and whispered, "Richard, shut up right now. If we push this to trial, you're not just losing the business, you're facing criminal corporate fraud charges. We have to settle." In less than 10 minutes, the entire power dynamic had completely inverted. The man who walked into court ready to throw me onto the street with $1,500 a month was now begging my attorney for a recess just to salvage his freedom. We reached a full settlement before the afternoon was over. Richard surrendered all claims to our real estate, handed over his remaining personal holdings to cover the funds he had secretly transferred offshore, and quietly resigned from the company. The young vice president who had helped him plot my downfall left the firm just 2 weeks later when the financial reality set in. As for me, I sold the commercial properties, closed that chapter of my life, and relocated to a breathtaking coastal estate in Carmel. At 57, I finally launched my own independent corporate advisory firm, using 3 decades of hidden experience to help other women protect their assets and stand up for their rights. Richard thought 30 years of silence meant weakness, but he learned the hard way that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding all the power. Now, I want to ask you, have you ever been completely underestimated by someone who thought they had total control over your life? How did you handle it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching.